Good afternoon, everybody. This is Cybertal, coming back at you with all things chess. We're getting back into our examination of hanging pawns after our brief tribute to Yevgeny Sveshnikov. We're picking up the side of how to play against the hanging pawns. So we went over a bunch of dynamic examples of how to handle using the hanging pawns as an attacking resource, looking at the extra activity in the open lines and diagonals that you get with hanging pawns. We're going to take the other side and see how to neutralize hanging pawn activity and certain positional features to keep things under control, positionally exploit the theoretical weakness. First few games, I think we're going to take a look at the important square in front of the c-pawn. Really, the main opportunity to control hanging pawns are within the first few moves of their creation, where you can prevent the c-pawn from advancing or control the squares in front of the hanging pawns to corral their movement and mobility and activity. This is a relatively obscure example. This is a blitz game on Title Tuesday, but I think it's a good game because it's actually representative of a normal hanging pawn game. It's not an idealized example where the side playing against the hanging pawns just gets an absolutely perfect bind and everything works in perfect harmony. We'll look at a couple of those, but I wanted to start an examination of how to blockade the c-pawn with a real-world example that actually sort of meshes with how it'll actually play out usually in your games, rather than some boulderized, idealized version. So this is Sean Rodriguez against Alexandra David. This is a Title Tuesday Blitz game. C4. This is part of my repertoire. And we very quickly transpose to the Tarash. The Tarash defense really can be reached from virtually any opening that starts with d4, c4, knight f3, g3. It's a completely ubiquitous opening. So more or less, unless you play solely 1e4, you're going to have to know the Tarash defense and to know at least the basic themes of how to play against the Tarash, which means you'll have to know how to play against both isolated pawns and hanging pawns. So just like isolated pawns, knowing how to play against hanging pawns is nearly an essential feature for any well-rounded chess player. So we're suddenly into the Tarash, knight f6. This just goes in the main line. cx-d4. This has become a little more popular nowadays. Black has gotten a little bit tired with dealing with the hyper-technical main line. The classical main line is bishop e7, bishop g5. And there are a few main moves here. There's c4. I know that's one of the more aggressive lines. There's h6 first, or no, it's cx-d4. And then h6. But the main attraction of cx-d4, these are all very hyper-technical, theoretical lines for black, especially c4. c4 is sort of the modern main line. The cause has been taken up by a few recent repertoire books. The theory here goes out to move 30. And black theoretically is holding the balance, but it's very, very difficult stuff, where black really isn't playing at the board all that much. He's just sort of vomiting up the opening theory and hoping that white doesn't have an improvement prepared somewhere. cx-d4, it's got a lot more breadth to it, so black can hopefully try to actually get some play at the board instead of just spewing forth opening theory. I think this is equally as valuable as bishop e7 personally. This just goes straight to the isolated pawn. Bishop c5, so this does gain some time. That's another advantage to cx-d4. Bishop c5, it's a development move that comes with tempo. That's certainly gain. Knight x c6, so this goes straight into hanging pawns. Knight b3 should be considered as well. This goes just into an isolated queen pawn, where the bishop on g2, white will argue that having that strong fianchetto bishop lined up against the isolated pawn is an immediate gain. I would personally play this way as whites. That bishop on g2 is going to be incredibly strong. Now, black's got his own positive features as well. You know, this bishop it'll drop back to b6. That's a very strong piece. Black has very free development. You know, castle, bishop e6, queen d7, something like that. But white has good plays here as well. Whereas after knight x c6, so this goes straight into hanging pawns. And white's going to be able to control the movement of these pawns. But in this particular position, black doesn't really want to move these pawns anyways, because this pawn couplet of c6 and d5 very nicely controls that bishop on g2. So I think objectively they might be of equal value, but I think subjectively the isolated pawn is a little bit easier to play here for white, because in this particular position, that bishop on g2 is actually a pretty poor piece, whereas black's bad bishop on c8 actually has some decent scope. It can hop to a6 or g4, where it's actually doing some good work. But white goes for the hanging pawns. Queen c2. Knight a4 is a little bit interesting. So it's not just a transposition, this is an entirely different way of playing. So bishop b6, and then knight x b6. So this isn't looking to control the hanging pawns, this is just looking to get the asset of the bishop pair. And this is very hyper-modern from white. So white's basically grabbing the bishop pair, giving black a preponderance in the center. In exchange, he's going to use that bishop pair to try to bombard that center into the earth. This is very attractive to me as white, just because most of my repertoire includes hyper-modern openings. This will be good dynamic play. I think objectively this is balanced, and this is going to be a fun game to come. So queen c2, just a little bit more control, just looking to modestly control the hanging pawns movement. Knight a4. So the c5 square is already locked down under control. That's good news for white. The bad news, control of the c5 square is not enough. That's a means to an end. We're controlling the square in front of the hanging pawn, so that means the hanging pawn can't advance. White can also put a piece on c5, where it'll actually be placed pretty well. But that's not an end to itself. He wants to use that outpost and that weak square in c5 as a means to something else. If white's never able to generate some sort of play connected with that square, he's not actually gaining from the outpost. And in fact, in some cases, if he moves his knight to c5, that knight could end up being misplaced if he just never generates play from it. So again, the outpost on c5 isn't enough. It's not an end in itself. It's a means to an end. You're controlling black's play by making sure the c-pawn can't move, but then white needs to find positive play in conjunction with that. Simply the outpost by itself isn't an achievement in itself. The thing in itself isn't the outpost. It's the benefits the outpost can hopefully accrue. Bishop d7, knight c5. This is a mistake. Controlling the square is adequate. The knight in c5 doesn't actually do anything. I mean, it's not attacking any other pawn, and actually in some cases, it's blocking black's c-pawn from attack, which gives black a little bit more leeway in his response. Ideally, white would just love to triple up his major piece on the c-file and try to bombard that c-pawn into the dirt, and eventually try to trade off this light square bishop. If the knight's on c5 just sitting there nice looking, it actually protects black's c-pawn for him while black tries to generate his own play, presumably on the king side. Better for white, I think, is just taking. So this repairs black's pawns, but in return, white gets this bishop pair. In modern play, in modern theory, the bishop pair is seen as a real asset that's worth chasing compared to a lot of strategic factors. We don't see the hanging pawns as such a dire weakness anymore that neglecting to gain the bishop pair is worth it. The bishop pair, especially in this position, is a huge asset, because look at the way they're just perfectly coordinated to bombard black's queenside pawns. This is a very well-coordinated bishop pair, and I think here it's worth repairing black's pawn structure to gain that bishop pair. Whereas after knight c5, the knight looks nice, but that's it. It doesn't accrue any benefits by moving to c5. Bishop g4, bishop e3. This is another mistake. Now, it's not a strategic mistake. A lot of times, this is where you want your bishop to go, because it's helping control the c5 square. It can move to d4, where it controls the square in front of that hanging pawn. There's just a specific tactical error with this that we'll see. b4 was better. This is just one potential line. And this is completely balanced. White's a-pawn is just as likely to be a weakness as a strength. The pawns on c6 and d5 completely defang this bishop. So this bishop on g2 is never going to be active as long as those pawns are there. This is pretty much an impasse. Bishop e3 is vulnerable to a specific defect. Queen e7 is a mistake. Rook e8 is better, and it's Notice how the e2 pawn is undefended in conjunction with the bishop on g4 and the rook on e8. So the bishop on e3 can't move. This makes white vulnerable to an exchange sacrifice that's actually quite effective here. So rook ac1. There's another line that I'll list in the notes. As usual, I'll list the game notes in the comments that you can look through. But after rook ac1, this is a classic exchange sacrifice that just needs to be in your database. And this transposes to the previous line that I talked about, but here black has excellent compensation. At the very least, black is going to win back the e3 pawn at some point. Neither of the white rooks really make much of an impression. And white's weaknesses on the king side completely outweigh any material edge that white might have. So queen e7, it's not bad, but rook e8 is stronger because that exchange sacrifice here is quite strong. Okay, c8, rook f8, b4. Again, when we're controlling the square in front of the c pawn, it's not the excessive control of the square itself. White's already got 1, 2, 3, 4 pieces controlling the c5 square. He doesn't need another. Moving the b pawn doesn't accomplish anything. It's not the square in itself that accomplishes something. It's the benefits you accrue from that outpost. Right now, white isn't accruing any benefits from controlling the c5 square. Not even having the knight on c5 is really has been a benefit at all. b4 also opens white up to an a5 pawn break, which is a specific problem. Better would be rook fe1. That helps protect the e2 pawn, which is a major strategic drawback for white here. And then white can slowly improve with moves like bishop d4, and potentially play e4. When you have a knight on c5 like this, and if I can play a game of repetition, this is something to hear a lot from me in previous videos and in future videos. Pawn breaks are the most important thing you need to be looking at. Always look to your pawn breaks. They are the engine of your play, the engine of your counterplay. They're often the focal points of your planning. If you're not achieving your pawn breaks, you're probably not achieving sufficient play. Here, especially in conjunction with the knight on c5, the pawn break e4 is especially powerful, because it's very well supported by this knight on c5, and it's a break that you'll often see against the hanging pawns to further weaken them. Especially here, because this bishop on g2 is so weak, with these pawns creating a granite block that it's fighting on, the break e4 would jailbreak this bishop on g2 and make it even more powerful. So rook fe1 protects the pawn on e2, but also long-term plans that pawn break with e4. This would be a balanced game. b4, it's weakening. It opens white up to the a5 pawn break. And again, controlling the square on c5 isn't an end in itself. You know, white could line up every single piece that he has to control c5, but it doesn't accomplish anything. It's a means to an end. And the end needs to be generating play against the weak c6 square, or c6 pawn, or some other weakness that black has. Just owning the square in itself isn't an end to itself. Okay, c8. Bishop h5, this is a little bit weak. a5, again, always look to your pawn breaks. This is a very natural move here. One example. This is pretty much dead equal. Neither side can really break the impasse. These pawns in c6 and d5 are thoroughly blockaded, but white can't do anything because his pieces need to remain in place to keep that blockade. So, pretty much as a mutual Zugzwang there. Neither side can really make any progress. a4. Bishop f3 is probably a little bit more accurate. The one potential line I give. This is similar to the previous line, but it's a little bit better coordinated for whites. a4. Knight g4 is the first clear error from black. And this puts black in a very dangerous situation, where white is finally achieving play based on having his knight the control of the c5 square. a5 is crucial. Again, always get your pawn breaks in when you can. White has the strategic threat of a5, pushing that dark square bishop back. So black gets a5 in to prevent that a5 push from white. Bishop f1. And I'd say I prefer white a little bit here. The bishop on d4 is quite strong, and the knight on c5 is definitely an asset. But the problem is the knight on c5, it doesn't do anything. It's one of those pretty-looking pieces that doesn't achieve anything concrete. If the knight on c5 were to suddenly disappear, that would put white at risk of a c5 push, unleashing those pawns finally. Which means the knight on c5 is strong, but it's sort of stuck in place. It's sort of the prisoner's dilemma, or the slave-master relationship that Nietzsche talked about. Neither side can really budge from that position without loss to themselves. But knight g4 is a clear error. Bishop d4, a5. So, because black didn't achieve a5 himself, because black didn't achieve that pawn break, white's going to play that, gaining space and pushing that bishop back, or getting the trade, which would be disastrous. So, black pushes back. f3, this is a clear error. Petrosian once laconically intoned that pawns can't move backwards. Petrosian is my favorite player of all time. His strategic insights would improve anyone. Pawns can't move backwards. It's sort of a basic, almost childlike observation, but it's incredibly deep. No matter what pawn move you're making, it's incredibly vital to make sure it's actually necessary, because you can't take a pawn move back, so it's more or less a permanent feature of the position. f3 here, it's a little bit weakening. I would prefer queen c3. And then rook e1. Again, when you have a knight on c5, when you've chosen to basically perma-occupy the c5 square, e4 is going to be a very strong pawn break at times. Here, it's perfect for white, because that knight on c5 is so strong. e4, it's perfectly prepared, and it'll finally wake up that bishop on g2. This would be a great position for white. This would be nearly strategically winning. f3 is just a little bit weakening. g6, queen c3. h5 here, it's sort of an empty shot because black doesn't have any actual kingside play to back this up, so it's just sort of weakening. Bishop d6 is better just because it sort of holds serve. Bishop h3, this is a very common resource to activate this bishop. If you can't achieve e4, the bishop will often hop to h3 to sort of wake itself up. Bishop f1, this is a clear loss in time. This is pointless. f4 is the right timing. This is pretty much a forced line. And this is close to winning for whites. It could theoretically get to an opposite colored bishop ending, where black has drawing chances, but otherwise, black's going to be down at least a pawn, potentially more, and this is just a very difficult position for black to hold. This would be close to winning for white, if not outright winning. Bishop f1, just a clear loss in time. There's no reason to be so passive. h4, a little bit weakening. But this is a blitz game, so this is a sort of move that you can play in blitz without thinking too hard. f4, this is weakening in return. This is actually sort of critical. Queen e3 is a little bit more accurate. Right now, we're outside of sort of the strategic contours of the point of the game, so I'm going to give the rest of the game without too many comments. g4. Bishop x g7, this is a clear error. As I give in the game notes, you can examine queen f3 is much better. Queen a3, this misses a complete knockout blow. This is still much better for black, but bishop x f4 is just a complete devastation. And white can resign with a clear conscience. Rook h8 is coming in. There's no good answer to that. Bishop f6. Bishop d4 is a little bit better. This would be my favorite Petrosian-esque theme. This would be the positional exchange sacrifice. And this would be a very good one for whites. This bishop on d4 is better than either of black's rooks. The one bias that I had to get over when I was improving, I'm 37. My first rating when I was 11 was 1098, but when I was 12 or 13, I got mad enough at my own bad play that I really hunkered down and wanted to improve. And the one bias that I had to get over to finally break master when I was, I think, 15, 16 or so, was getting over the bias of looking at material as a binding thing. So many times we look at material as this holy writ that we can't violate. And the only way to give up material is if we see an absolute clear win. Like, if we sacrifice a piece, we have to see mate in 11 pop up on our mental screen somehow. In this sort of position, mate's nowhere to be seen. You know, this is going to be a long endgame, but this bishop on d4 is so powerful that it completely outweighs the exchange advantage. White even has a pawn, but let's say you added a weak token pawn on, say, I don't know, g7 here. It wouldn't change the position all that much. The extra pawn helps, and that certainly tips the balance towards white. But this bishop on d4 is so powerful that it's hard to say that white's rooks or black's rooks really matter all that much. They don't have any scope in the position. They don't have any open files to work with. Whereas this bishop on d4 completely rules the board. So this would be an excellent positional exchange sacrifice from white. This bishop d4. This would be at least slightly better for white. I would take white every day of the week from this position. Bishop f6 is just not necessary. Rook c8 is a clear error. This is more or less a forced. This is similar to the previous line, but it's a little bit worse for white, just because black's pieces are a little bit more accurate, more coordinated. The black bishop has some scope coming to e4. White would have enough compensation here, but not more than enough. But rook c8 is a clear error. Now the rook just moves. g4, and then rook h1, and the mate threat overrides everything. This game is over. That's a mistake. King g1. That's just outright mate. Rook x g2. That's a clear error. This is the way for black to maintain the game. Again, you can look at those notes on your own time. This is sort of way past the scope of the Hayne pawns discussion. And black finally resigned. The mate threat with rook h8 is completely overpowering. But the actual strategic meat of the game that I want to review is all the way back here. So again, I chose this game because it is a bit more of a normal game to look at. It's not some idealized, boulderized version where white just gets a perfect clear grip and the rest of the game is clear sailing. When the hanging pawns are first created, that's when you're fighting against the hanging pawns, you want to try to fight for a grip in the position, where black, or the side with the hanging pawns, can't advance those freely. Now, white accomplishes that. He gains control of the c5 square. But control of the square is not enough. Again, the pawn on c6 is a real weakness, because no black pawn can guard it. There's no black b pawn, there's no other black d pawn. The black d pawn can't move backwards, as bequeathed by Petrosian. The pawn on c6 is a real weakness, but moving the knight to c5 creates a shield for that pawn. If white lines up all of his major pieces on the c-file, that c-pawn can't be attacked because that white knight is standing on c5. Controlling the c5 square in itself is not enough. White needs to either simply control the c5 square and slowly build up on the weakness of the c-pawn, or if he occupies it, needs to accrue some sort of benefit from that occupation. He needs to use that knight to build up for the e4 pawn break. He needs to use that control of the c5 square. Really, that's about it. The outpost on c5 isn't attractive in and of itself. It's the play that you can accrue from it that matters. Because, as we see in the game, in what way is this knight on c5 really inconveniencing black? It's not. It looks pretty. It's sort of like in a lot of King's Indian defense positions where white slowly maneuvers his knight deep into enemy territory to, say, c6, but it doesn't matter because he's getting mated on the other side of the board. It's quite similar to here. The knight on c5 looks pretty, but it doesn't accomplish anything for whites. So this is sort of a warning for the rest of our series. Controlling the c5 square is great because it mobilizes that c6 pawn. It holds it in place as a weakness. But occupying that c5 outpost isn't necessarily a good in itself. You want to be accruing some specific benefit from that occupation. If you can't name a benefit of the occupation of that outpost, more than likely you're much better served in simply continuing to develop or mobilizing or getting more pieces on the c-file to point to that backward pawn. Here in the game, occupying the c5 square did absolutely nothing for whites. So, sort of a cautionary tale. The rest of the game was a little bit messy, but it is a very normal strategic sort of battle from this sort of position. Again, that b4 push was a mistake because white already owns the c5 square many times over. There's no reason to invest more time in reinforcing that square. In fact, that opens him up to an a5 pawn break that could destabilize that square. But after a better move like rook fe1, this is just a normal strategic battle. Again, the c5 knight looks pretty, but it hasn't done anything for white. So I wanted to start our examination of playing against the hanging pawns with ultimately a win for the side fighting against the hanging pawns, because ultimately white gets the sort of squeeze that he's looking for. Once he's able to advance this pawn to a5, this is the sort of squeeze where suddenly the occupation of the c5 and the d4 squares is starting to choke the side with the hanging pawns. But this is due to some real strategic missteps from black. But again, I wanted to start with also sort of a cautionary tale to not get too enthusiastic about that weakness on the c5 square. If you can occupy it with a benefit, great. But really the main thing is control. You want to immobilize these pawns, but continue mobilizations that can actually gain some benefit from these pawns being immobile. So, in my opinion, a very interesting game to start with our examination with. We're going to continue tomorrow by looking at more examples of control of the c5 square and when that's actually beneficial for the side fighting against the hanging pawns. My name's John. I'll see you then.